In 2007, Nokia sold half the phones on planet Earth. Not half the smartphones, half the phones. Every second person you passed on the street, in Helsinki, in Lagos, in Delhi, had one in their pocket. 7 years later, Nokia sold its phone business for parts, pennies on the dollar, to Microsoft of all companies. If you're old enough to remember snapping that back cover off to swap a battery, you already know something went wrong here. What you probably don't know is how wrong and how fast. This is how the biggest phone company in history saw the future coming and still missed it. 1865, Nokia didn't start as a phone company. It didn't even start as an electronics company. A paper mill on a river in southern Finland. That's it. That's the whole company. Decades later, it merges with a rubber factory and a cable maker. By the 1960s, Nokia is making car tires, rain boots, and toilet paper under the same roof. Then, 1967, 3 unrelated Finnish companies merge into one conglomerate. Paper, rubber, cables. Nobody plans for this to become a phone company. It just absorbs things. Buried inside that cable division, a small team starts building military radios. Then car phones, the size of a briefcase for generals and executives only. And in 1991, from that same quiet division, Nokia's technology carries the world's first GSM call, the standard that would define mobile phones for the next 2 decades. Nobody at the paper mill saw this coming. That's the point. Finland is in the worst recession of its post-war history. Nokia is bleeding money across a dozen different businesses, TVs, cables, rubber boots, and the board hands the company to a 41-year-old former banker named Jorma Ollila. He'd never run a company this size, and his first move was almost reckless. Ollila looks at every division Nokia owns and asks one question: does this have anything to do with mobile phones? If the answer's no, it's gone. The TVs, sold. The cables, sold. The rubber boots that built the company in the first place, sold. In just a few years, Nokia goes from a sprawling conglomerate making everything to a company betting everything on one idea: that mobile phones aren't a luxury item. They're about to be for everyone. At the time, this looked like a gamble bordering on insane. Motorola owned the phone market. Nobody sane bet against Motorola. Ollila did. And by 1998, Nokia isn't chasing Motorola anymore. Nokia is the biggest phone maker on Earth. If you owned a phone in the early 2000s, there's a good chance it was this one. The Nokia 3310, released in 2000. It didn't do email. It didn't do internet. Not really. It made calls, sent texts, and let you play Snake on a train platform for 20 minutes straight. And it was, by any measure, indestructible. Drop it down a flight of stairs, run it over, throw it across a room, it didn't care. There are still people today who half joke that their old 3310 is out there somewhere, still working, in a landfill. Then there was the tune. Nokia didn't just make a ringtone, they made the ringtone. The one sound almost anyone over 30 can still hum from memory. That's not marketing. That's cultural saturation most companies would kill for. By the mid-2000s, Nokia isn't just winning, it's dominant. Nearly 4 out of every 10 phones sold on the planet are Nokia. Not just in Europe, not just in wealthy countries, in villages across Africa, in rural India, in places where a Nokia phone was often the first phone a family ever owned. And back home in Finland, a country of just 5 million people, Nokia is, at its peak, responsible for roughly a quarter of the entire country's exports. One company, a quarter of a nation's economy. Whole towns exist because Nokia has a factory there. An entire generation of Finnish engineers builds their careers assuming Nokia will simply always be there. Nokia isn't just a phone company anymore, it's the safest bet in technology. And in boardrooms from Helsinki to California, there is only one company anyone is even trying to compete with. They just don't know they're about to stop being the ones asking that question. January 9th, 2007, San Francisco. Steve Jobs walks on stage and holds up a phone with no keypad, no stylus, just a screen you touch with your finger. Inside Nokia, the reaction wasn't panic. It was something closer to confusion. Because on paper, Nokia had nothing to worry about. Look at the spec sheet. Nokia's flagship at the time, the N95, actually beat the first iPhone in almost every category that mattered to a phone engineer. Better camera, faster network. The iPhone launched on painfully slow 2G, while the N95 already had 3G. Physical buttons you could press without looking. Replaceable battery. Longer battery life. By every metric, Nokia had spent a decade optimizing. The iPhone looked like a step backward. One Nokia executive would later admit the room's honest reaction to that keynote wasn't fear. It was closer to relief. That's it? That's what everyone's so excited about? Here's what the spec sheet couldn't show them. The iPhone wasn't a better phone. It was a different kind of product. Nokia had spent 20 years making the best possible device for calling and texting. Apple had just built a pocket-sized computer that happened to make calls, and a year later, they'd open it up to outside developers with the App Store. Turning every iPhone owner into a customer for thousands of apps Apple didn't even have to build themselves. Nokia was still asking, how do we make a better phone? Apple had already stopped asking that question. They were building a platform, and every app, every developer, every update after launch would make that platform more valuable, while Nokia's phones stayed exactly what they were the day you bought them. Nokia didn't lose because their phones got worse. Their phones didn't get worse at all. They lost because they were still winning a competition nobody else had shown up to anymore. So if Nokia understood, even a little, that the game had changed, why didn't they just change with it? The answer is a 5-letter word that doesn't sound dramatic at all. Symbian. Symbian was Nokia's operating system, built years before the iPhone existed, back when smartphone meant a phone that could check email. It had never been designed to run touch-based apps smoothly, and retrofitting it wasn't like flipping a switch. Engineers described it as trying to renovate a house while it was still on fire. And here's the part that doesn't make it into most retellings. Nokia knew. Internally, engineers were raising alarms about Symbian's limitations years before the iPhone even launched. The problem was never that nobody saw it coming. The problem was Nokia, by this point, wasn't one company making one decision. It was multiple teams, multiple internal projects, competing operating systems being built inside the same building. MeeGo here, Symbian there, each with its own leadership, its own budget, its own reasons the other project was the wrong bet. Decisions that should have taken months took years. By the time anything shipped, the market had already moved again. Meanwhile, over at Google, a small team was building something called Android, free for any phone maker to use, and built from day one around the exact touchscreen, App Store future Nokia was still arguing about internally. Nokia had the money. They had the engineers. What they didn't have was the ability to make a decision and stick with it. By 2010, Nokia's share of the global phone market had already slid from over 50% to under 30%, and it was still falling. September 2010. Nokia's board makes a decision that stuns Finland. For the first time in the company's history, they hire a non-Finnish CEO, Stephen Elop, a Canadian, and, this detail matters, a former Microsoft executive. 4 months into the job, Elop does something no CEO in Nokia's history had ever done. He writes an internal memo to the entire company, and it leaks. It becomes known as the Burning Platform Memo, and it is brutal. Elop compares Nokia to a man standing on a burning oil platform in the North Sea who has one choice left: jump into freezing water or burn. He writes that Nokia is losing on high-end and low-end, that competitors aren't taking market share with devices, they're taking it with an entire ecosystem. He says essentially, everything you think you know about why we're still winning, we're not. To employees who'd spent decades building the best-selling phones on Earth, reading this from their own CEO felt less like honesty and more like a hostage tale. And then Elop announces the decision the memo was building toward. Nokia is abandoning Symbian, abandoning MeeGo, betting the entire company's future on Microsoft's Windows Phone. The market's reaction is immediate. Nokia's stock drops over 10% in a single day. Investors don't hear bold new strategy. They hear a company admitting out loud that everything it had built no longer worked. Here's the part that stings even now. Weeks after that memo, Nokia releases the N9, a phone running Migo, the very platform Elop had just killed. Critics call it beautiful. Some call it the best phone Nokia had ever made. It didn't matter. Even their best reviewed phone in years had launched into a platform Elop had already buried. Nokia wasn't just changing direction anymore. It was starting over, from a company that used to lead. To be fair to Elop, the phones themselves were good, really good. The Lumia line launches to genuinely strong reviews. Bright, distinctive colors instead of the usual black slabs. A camera on the Lumia 1020 that outshot phones costing twice as much. Reviewers who'd spent years mocking Nokia's slow decline were, for the first time in a while, impressed. The hardware was never the problem. The problem was what happened when you actually turned the phone on. You open the App Store, looking for the apps everyone else has, and they're just not there. No Instagram for years, no Snapchat. Banking apps skip Windows Phone entirely. Games launch on iPhone and Android first, if they launch at all. Sometimes a year later, sometimes never. And here's the trap. Developers won't build for a phone nobody's buying, and customers won't buy a phone with no apps. Nokia is stuck in the middle of a cycle with no obvious way out. A great phone running a great operating system that almost nobody wants. Every quarter, Windows Phone's market share ticks down instead of up. Every quarter, fewer developers bother building for it. The device gets better. The ecosystem around it gets worse. And by 2013, even Elop's own strategy had become impossible to defend. The gamble hadn't just failed. It had failed in the one way nobody in that boardroom had planned for. September 2013, Microsoft buys Nokia's entire phone business. The company that once sold half the phones on Earth, gone, for around $7 billion. Less than what Nokia's phone division was worth at its peak in a single good year. Elop walks away with an exit payout so large, Finnish media start calling it his reward for failure. 2 years later, Microsoft writes off almost the entire deal as a loss and quietly shuts down what's left. But here's the question that still gets argued in comment sections and boardrooms today. What if, back in 2011, Elop had picked Android instead of Windows Phone? Android was free, open, already gaining the exact momentum Windows Phone never would. Would Nokia's hardware, paired with Google's ecosystem, have saved them? Nobody knows. And that's what makes it sting. In Finland, tens of thousands of jobs disappeared with that sale. Engineers, factory workers, entire towns that had built their lives around one company they assumed would always be there. Today, the Nokia name still exists on phones again, through a small company called HMD, respected, but a fraction of what it once was. Nokia didn't fall because they stopped innovating. They fell because they kept winning a race they didn't realize had already ended. And by the time they looked up, someone else had already redrawn the finish line. Subscribe to Empires of Silicon if you like business stories, case studies, and leave a like if have ever used a Nokia.